Have you ever had a perfect conversation in English, completely alone? In your room, in your car, in the shower, you speak beautifully, your sentences flow, your grammar feels natural, you even sound confident. But the moment a real person appears in front of you, someone from the office, a stranger on the street, a customer, a friend of a friend, something inside you shuts down. Your mind goes blank, your throat feels tight. The same words you said perfectly 5 minutes ago now feel impossible to find. If this has ever happened to you, I want you to know something very important right now, at the very beginning of this video. You are not bad at English, you are not slow, you are not someone who lacks talent for languages. What is happening to you has a name, it has a reason, and most importantly, it has a solution. My name is Professor Henry, and this is English Mind Training, the place where we do not just study English, we study the mind that speaks English. Today we are going to open up one of the most painful and most common experiences that English learners around the world go through, the strange gap between the English you can speak alone and the English that disappears the moment someone is listening. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly why this happens inside your brain, and you will walk away with real tools you can use today to close that gap forever. So take a breath, get comfortable, and let us begin this journey together. Chapter 1: The hidden difference between talking and performing. Let us start with something simple but powerful. When you speak English alone, you are not really speaking. You are thinking out loud. There is no audience, there is no judge, there is no one watching your face, your accent, your grammar, or your pauses. Your brain treats this kind of speaking almost like private thinking, the same category as daydreaming or planning your day in your head. But the moment another human being steps into that space, your brain immediately changes its evaluation of the situation. It no longer sees this as private thinking, it sees this as a performance. And performance to your brain means one thing above all else: risk. Risk of being judged, risk of looking foolish, risk of being seen as less intelligent, less capable, less worthy of respect. This shift happens in a fraction of a second, and it happens without your permission. You do not choose to feel this fear, it activates automatically, the same way your hand pulls back automatically from something hot. This is not weakness, this is biology. Human beings evolved in small tribal groups, where being rejected by the group could mean literal death. If you were seen as foolish, incompetent, or strange, you could be excluded from the tribe, and exclusion meant losing protection, food, and safety. Your brain still carries this ancient alarm system today, even though modern rejection usually means nothing more than a slightly awkward 5 seconds. Your nervous system does not know the difference between a life-threatening tribal rejection thousands of years ago and a coworker noticing you paused before saying a sentence in English. To your amygdala, the small almond-shaped alarm center deep in your brain, both situations trigger the same response: fight, flight, or freeze. And in speaking situations, freeze is usually the winner. Your mind goes blank not because you forgot English, but because a part of your brain is temporarily prioritizing safety over communication. This is why so many learners feel confused and even ashamed. They think, I studied for years, I know grammar rules better than some native speakers, I can write long essays, so why can I not open my mouth in front of one single person? The answer is that knowledge and performance live in two different systems inside you. Knowledge lives in what we call declarative memory, the part of your brain that stores facts, rules, and vocabulary. Performance, especially under social pressure, depends heavily on your emotional state, specifically your level of perceived safety. When fear activates, it does not delete your knowledge, but it blocks your access to it. Imagine a library where all your English knowledge is stored perfectly on the shelves, but suddenly the lights go out. The books are still there. You simply cannot see them in that moment. That is what happens when fear takes over during speaking. Your English has not disappeared. Your access has been temporarily blocked by your own nervous system trying, in a very outdated way, to protect you. Understanding this single idea can already reduce a huge amount of your anxiety, because now you know the freezing is not proof that you are bad at English. It is proof that your brain is doing exactly what human brains have done for hundreds of thousands of years, protecting you from social danger. The problem is not your intelligence. The problem is an outdated alarm system reacting to a modern situation as if it were a survival threat. And once we understand where the fear is coming from, we can begin training our mind to respond differently. That is exactly what we are going to build together throughout the rest of this video. It also helps to notice that this freeze response is not constant. It fluctuates depending on context. You may have noticed that your English feels a little easier with one particular person, perhaps a patient colleague or a kind stranger, compared to another person who seems to trigger stronger anxiety, perhaps a manager, a teacher, or someone whose opinion of you feels especially important. This difference is not random. It directly reflects how much perceived social risk your brain assigns to each specific situation. The lower the perceived risk, the more access you retain to your English knowledge. The higher the perceived risk, the more that access becomes blocked. This single observation gives us an enormously useful roadmap for the rest of this video. If we can gradually lower the perceived risk of speaking situations, piece by piece, we can gradually restore your full access to the English you already know, even in situations that currently feel overwhelming. Chapter 2. The inner voice that is working against you. Every single one of us has a voice inside our head that comments on everything we do. Psychologists call this the inner voice or self-talk, and for most English learners, this voice becomes a harsh, unfair critic the moment English speaking is involved. Think about the last time you tried to speak English with someone and hesitated. What was happening inside your head in that exact moment? For most learners, it sounds something like this. They are going to think I am stupid, my accent is terrible, I am going to make a grammar mistake and everyone will notice. I should already be fluent by now, what is wrong with me? This person speaks so much better than me. I am wasting their time. Notice something important about these thoughts. They are not about English itself. They are judgments about your worth, your intelligence, and your identity. This is the real danger of negative self-talk. It does not simply criticize your sentence structure. It attacks your sense of self. When this inner critic becomes loud enough, it creates what we can call a feedback loop of fear. You feel anxious, so the inner voice becomes harsher. The inner voice becomes harsher, so you feel more anxious. More anxiety makes it even harder to access your English vocabulary and grammar, which then gives the inner voice new evidence. See, I told you, you cannot do this. This loop can repeat itself in less than 2 seconds, faster than conscious thought, which is why so many learners describe the experience as suddenly forgetting everything, as if a switch turned off in their brain. It is not that you forgot. It is that this loop hijacked your mental resources before you even had a chance to speak. Here is something fascinating that research on self-talk has shown again and again. The way you talk to yourself directly shapes your physiological state. When your inner voice is harsh and threatening, your body responds as if there is real danger present. Your heart rate increases, your muscles tense, especially around your jaw, throat, and chest, and your breathing becomes shallow. This is exactly why so many learners say their throat feels tight or their chest feels heavy right before speaking English in front of someone. This is not imagination, it is your nervous system responding to threatening self-talk as if it were a real physical threat. Shallow breathing reduces oxygen flow to your brain, which further reduces your ability to think clearly and retrieve words. In other words, your inner critic is not just unpleasant, it is biologically sabotaging your ability to speak well. Now here is the empowering part. Because this pattern is learned, it can also be unlearned and replaced. Your inner voice is not a fixed part of your personality. It is a habit built through repetition, often starting many years ago, sometimes from a teacher who corrected you harshly in front of classmates, sometimes from a culture that valued perfection over communication, sometimes from comparing yourself to others online who seem impossibly fluent. Whatever the origin, the habit was learned, which means a new habit can be built to replace it. The first step is simply becoming aware of the voice. Most learners never actually listen to what their inner voice says. It operates in the background so automatically that they only feel the anxiety without noticing the specific thoughts causing it. Starting today, I want you to become a curious observer of your own mind. The next time you feel that wave of fear before speaking English, pause for 1 second and ask yourself, what did my inner voice just say? Simply naming the thought reduces its power over you, because you move from being controlled by the thought to observing the thought, and observation is the first step toward change. Later in this video, we will build practical replacement phrases, calmer, kinder, more accurate internal statements that you can train yourself to use instead. But for now, simply understanding that this critical voice is a trained habit, not a fixed truth about your ability, is a massive shift. You are not naturally destined to freeze. You have simply practiced fear more than you have practiced calm confidence. And whatever you practice, you strengthen. This means the path forward is not about becoming a completely different person. It is about practicing a new, kinder, more useful inner voice until it becomes just as automatic as the old one used to be. I also want you to notice how often this inner critic uses extreme absolute language, words like always, never, everyone, and completely. They always notice my mistakes. I never sound natural. Everyone speaks better than me. My English is completely broken. Absolute language like this is almost never accurate. Real life is rarely so extreme. Yet the inner critic uses these words specifically because they feel urgent and convincing, triggering a stronger emotional reaction than more measured, realistic language would. As you begin observing your own inner voice this week, watch specifically for these absolute words, and when you notice them, gently ask yourself, is this actually true every single time, without exception? Almost always, the honest answer is no, and simply noticing this gap between the exaggerated claim and the more modest reality begins to loosen the grip this voice holds over your confidence. Chapter 3. Why talking to yourself feels so easy. Let us look more closely at the other side of this puzzle, the version of you that speaks so smoothly and confidently when you are completely alone. Understanding why this version of you performs so well is just as important as understanding why the fearful version freezes, because inside that comfortable, confident private speech lies the exact blueprint we need to bring into real conversations. When you speak alone, several powerful things happen at once, and most learners never consciously notice them. First, there is zero social evaluation. Nobody is measuring your grammar. Nobody is judging your pronunciation. Nobody is forming an opinion about your intelligence based on your sentence. Your brain classifies this activity as low stakes, similar to thinking or rehearsing, not as a public performance. Because the stakes feel low, your nervous system remains calm, your breathing stays steady, and calm breathing means more oxygen reaching your brain, which means faster, clearer access to vocabulary and grammar structures you already know. Second, when you speak alone, you naturally allow yourself to make mistakes without punishment. If you say a sentence incorrectly while talking to yourself in your room, you simply correct it and continue, often without even fully noticing the error. There is no pause of shame, no internal alarm bell, no fear of consequences. This freedom to make mistakes without emotional punishment is actually one of the most important ingredients of fluent speech. Fluency does not mean speaking without errors. Fluency means continuing to communicate despite errors, adjusting in real time the way native speakers themselves do constantly, even in their own language. When you are alone, you unconsciously already know this truth and you act on it naturally. The tragedy is that the moment another person appears, most learners abandon this healthy approach and switch into a perfectionist mode that actually damages their fluency. Third, and this is a detail many learners overlook, when you speak alone, you are often not translating from your native language in your head. You are simply expressing whatever thought arises directly in English, because there is no urgency, no time pressure created by another person waiting for your response. Real conversations create a subtle but powerful pressure, the pressure to respond quickly, to not leave uncomfortable silence, to keep pace with the rhythm of a native or fluent speaker. This time pressure pushes many learners back into their old habit of first thinking in their native language, then mentally translating word by word into English, a process that is slow, exhausting, and highly likely to trigger the freeze response we discussed earlier. When you are alone, without that time pressure, your mind naturally settles into direct English thought, exactly the skill we want to strengthen for real conversations. Now here is the strategic insight I want you to hold on to for the rest of this video. Your alone speaking is not a separate, disconnected skill from your conversation speaking. It is the same skill existing in a safer, calmer emotional environment. This means our goal is not to build a brand new speaking ability from zero. Our goal is to gradually transfer the calm, fluent, mistake-tolerant version of you that already exists when you are alone into situations involving other people. Think of it like a plant that grows beautifully inside a warm greenhouse, but struggles the moment it is placed outside in the cold. The solution is not to grow an entirely new plant. The solution is to slowly, gradually adjust the plant to outside conditions, a process gardeners call hardening off, where a plant is exposed to small amounts of outside stress at a time, gradually building resilience until eventually it can thrive outside just as well as it did inside the greenhouse. This is exactly the model we will use for your English speaking, and in the chapters ahead, I will show you specific practical exercises to build this gradual transfer, moving your confident, private English voice step by step into real public conversations. It is also worth noticing what does not need to change in this process. You do not need to learn new grammar rules you have never encountered before. You do not need to memorize thousands of new vocabulary words. Most learners who struggle with speaking anxiety already possess far more English knowledge than they realize, knowledge that becomes obvious the moment they speak comfortably alone or write a message with plenty of time to think. The transformation we are working toward in this video is not primarily about acquiring new information. It is about learning to access the information you already have under conditions that currently feel threatening. This is genuinely good news because it means you are likely much closer to confident, fluent conversation than you currently believe. The missing piece is not more study, it is the gradual, patient training of your nervous system to feel safe while using knowledge you have already worked hard to build. Chapter 4: The Spotlight Effect and the Truth About What People Actually Notice. I want to introduce you to one of the most liberating pieces of psychology research that exists for anyone who struggles with speaking anxiety. It is called the spotlight effect, and once you truly understand it, something inside your mind will shift permanently. The spotlight effect describes a very consistent pattern in human psychology. We dramatically overestimate how much other people notice, judge, and remember our mistakes and imperfections. In a well-known study, researchers asked a student to wear an embarrassing t-shirt into a room full of other students. The student wearing the shirt guessed that around half the room would notice and remember the shirt. In reality, when the other students were asked afterward, fewer than 1 in 4 even remembered seeing it. This gap between what we imagine others notice and what they actually notice is enormous, and it exists in almost every social situation, including, especially English conversations. Think about your own experience listening to someone else speak a foreign language. When a friend or colleague speaks to you in a language they are still learning, are you silently judging every grammar mistake, mentally keeping a list of their errors, forming a harsh opinion of their intelligence based on a mispronounced word? Almost certainly not. Most likely, you are focused on understanding their meaning, feeling appreciation that they are making an effort, perhaps even feeling warmth and respect toward them for trying. This is exactly how most listeners feel about you when you speak English. Yet the fear inside your mind convinces you otherwise. Your inner critic assumes the listener is thinking the harshest, most judgmental thoughts possible, when in reality, the listener is almost always far more forgiving, far more focused on communication than on evaluation, and far less attentive to small mistakes than you imagine. There is a deeper reason why this mismatch exists, and understanding it will help it sink in even more deeply. Humans are naturally self-focused, not because we are selfish, but because our own thoughts, feelings, and performance are simply louder and closer to us than anyone else is. Your embarrassment about a grammar mistake feels enormous to you because you are inside your own head, experiencing every microsecond of that discomfort. But the listener is inside their own head too, thinking about their own thoughts, their own day, their own concerns, and often barely processing the small details you are so worried about. This is not a comforting lie I am telling you to make you feel better. It is a well-documented pattern in human psychology, repeated across countless studies in different countries and cultures. People are simply far less focused on you than you assume because they are, understandably, mostly focused on themselves. I want you to actually test this idea in your own life, not just believe it because I said it. The next time you speak with someone in English and make a mistake, notice what actually happens on their face and in their response. Do they gasp in horror? Do they interrupt you to criticize your grammar? Do they walk away in disgust? In almost every case, none of these things happen. Most listeners either do not notice the mistake at all, correct it silently in their own mind without any visible reaction, or simply continue the conversation naturally because their goal, just like yours, is communication, not grammatical perfection. Collecting this real evidence from your own life is far more powerful than simply hearing me explain the psychology, because your brain trusts direct experience more than any lecture. Here is a practical mindset shift I want you to carry with you starting today. Before speaking English with someone, silently remind yourself they are focused on their own thoughts, not mine, and even if they notice a mistake, they will almost certainly forget it within minutes. This single reminder, repeated consistently before speaking situations, gradually rewires the automatic fear response we discussed in Chapter 1. You are essentially giving your ancient tribal alarm system updated, accurate information that says, this is not actually a dangerous evaluation, this is simply two people trying to understand each other. Over time, with repetition, your nervous system begins to believe this updated information, and the intensity of your freeze response begins to shrink, conversation by conversation, until speaking in front of others starts to feel almost as safe as speaking alone. There is one more layer to the spotlight effect worth exploring, and it involves memory rather than attention. Even in the rare moments when someone does notice a mistake you make, research on human memory shows that this noticing fades remarkably quickly. Unless a mistake is unusually dramatic or repeated many times, most listeners forget the specific details of a small conversational error within minutes or hours, their attention naturally moving on to the next thing happening in their day, their own tasks, their own conversations, their own concerns. The version of the mistake that lingers painfully for days or weeks usually exists only inside your own memory, replayed over and over by your inner critic, long after the listener themselves has completely forgotten it ever happened. Recognizing this asymmetry, the mistake fading quickly from their memory while lingering stubbornly in yours, can help you consciously release lingering embarrassment sooner rather than allowing a small, forgettable moment to replay painfully in your mind for far longer than it deserves. Chapter 5. Building confidence through small, winnable steps. One of the biggest mistakes English learners make is trying to jump directly from complete comfort, speaking alone in their room, to complete pressure, a full conversation with a native speaker or a group of colleagues at work. This is like trying to lift the heaviest weight in the gym on your very first day without ever training with lighter weights first. Of course it feels impossible. Of course it triggers fear, because your mind and your speaking muscles have not been gradually prepared for that level of challenge. The solution is something psychologists call graded exposure, a method used to treat many different types of anxiety, where a person faces their fear in small, manageable steps, each one only slightly more challenging than the last, allowing confidence to build naturally at every stage before moving forward. Let us design this ladder specifically for English-speaking anxiety. At the very bottom, the easiest and safest step is speaking English alone, exactly what you already do comfortably. This remains valuable and should continue throughout your entire learning journey, not just as a starting point, but as an ongoing practice space where you experiment freely with new vocabulary and sentence patterns without any risk. The next step up is speaking English to a recording device, your phone camera, or a voice recording app, imagining a friendly audience while you speak. This introduces a very small amount of the self-awareness that comes with being watched, since you know the recording exists, but there is still no real-time judgment happening, no immediate reaction to manage. The step after that is speaking English with someone you trust deeply, perhaps a supportive friend, a patient family member, or a language exchange partner who has specifically agreed to be encouraging and patient with you. This introduces real-time social interaction, but in the safest possible version, with someone whose reaction you already know will be kind. Many learners skip this crucial step entirely and try to jump straight into high-pressure situations, missing out on this valuable middle stage where real conversational skills, including recovering from mistakes in real time, can be practiced with much lower emotional risk. The next step involves speaking with a stranger in a low-stakes, brief interaction, for example, ordering food, asking for directions, or making small talk with someone you will likely never see again. These situations are ideal because the social consequences of any mistake are essentially zero. You will probably never interact with this person again, yet you still get the valuable experience of real-time, unscripted conversation with an unfamiliar person. Only after building comfort through these earlier steps should you move toward higher pressure situations, extended conversations with colleagues, presentations, job interviews, or conversations with people whose opinion of you matters long term. Notice how each step in this ladder only asks for a small, manageable increase in challenge, never a massive leap. This is the key principle of graded exposure, and it works because each successful step provides your nervous system with real evidence of safety, gradually retraining that ancient alarm system we discussed earlier. Every time you complete a step and survive it, even imperfectly, even with mistakes, your brain updates its threat assessment slightly. This situation is not actually as dangerous as I believed. Repeated enough times, this updated assessment becomes the new automatic response, replacing the old fear-based reaction. I want to give you a practical assignment right now, one you can begin today. Identify exactly where you currently sit on this ladder. Are you comfortable speaking alone, but have never tried recording yourself? Are you comfortable with trusted friends, but avoid strangers entirely? Are you comfortable with strangers in brief interactions, but freeze in professional settings? Wherever you currently sit, your task is not to jump to the top of the ladder immediately. Your task is simply to take the next single step, consistently, several times over the coming days and weeks, until that step starts to feel almost as comfortable as the step before it. Only then should you move to the next level. This patient, gradual approach might feel slower than you want, especially if you feel a sense of urgency about your English improving quickly. But I promise you, this gradual method builds a foundation so solid that your confidence becomes permanent rather than the fragile, temporary confidence that comes from forcing yourself into high-pressure situations before you are ready. Situations that often backfire and reinforce fear rather than reducing it. Slow, steady, consistent steps, taken in the right order, will get you to fluent, confident conversation far faster and far more permanently than desperate, forceful attempts at high-pressure situations before your nervous system is ready. I often compare this process to learning to swim in open water. Nobody sensible would begin swim training by jumping directly into ocean waves during a storm. Instead, a good swimming teacher starts in shallow, calm water, close to the edge of the pool, gradually moving toward deeper water only once comfort and basic skill have been established at each stage. Your speaking confidence deserves exactly this same thoughtful, gradual approach. There is no prize for rushing into the deepest, most frightening water before you are ready, and doing so often creates a bad experience that makes a person more afraid of water altogether, rather than more confident. Give yourself the same patience and structure you would naturally offer a swimming student, and trust that steady, well-ordered practice will carry you safely and confidently into even the deepest conversational waters over time. Chapter 6: The Power of Slowing Down Your Speech. If there is one single technique that creates an immediate, noticeable improvement in your speaking confidence, it is learning to slow down. Most English learners believe that speaking quickly is a sign of fluency, that fast speech proves advanced ability, and that pausing or speaking slowly reveals weakness. This belief is not only incorrect, it is actively working against you, making your speaking anxiety worse and your communication less clear. Let us understand why slowing down is one of the most powerful tools available to you, and why almost every confident, clear speaker in any language uses deliberate pacing rather than rushed, panic speech. When you feel anxious during a conversation, your body naturally wants to speed up. This is part of the fight, flight, or freeze response we discussed earlier. Your nervous system wants to get through the uncomfortable situation as quickly as possible, similar to how someone might want to run quickly past something frightening rather than walk slowly beside it. This is why nervous speakers often rush their words, skip natural pauses, and speak in a slightly higher-pitched, faster rhythm than they would if they were calm. Unfortunately, speaking quickly while anxious creates a vicious cycle. Fast speech under pressure increases the likelihood of grammar mistakes, mispronunciations, and forgotten words because your brain simply does not have enough processing time to organize each sentence properly before your mouth produces it. These mistakes then increase your anxiety further, which pushes your speech even faster, creating a downward spiral that can turn a simple conversation into an overwhelming, chaotic experience. Slowing down interrupts this cycle at its root. When you consciously choose to speak more slowly, several powerful things happen simultaneously. First, you give your brain more processing time between thoughts, allowing you to access vocabulary, apply grammar rules, and organize your sentence structure with far greater accuracy. This alone dramatically reduces the number of mistakes you make, which in turn reduces anxiety because there are simply fewer errors triggering your inner critic. Second, slower speech naturally calms your physical body. Your breathing becomes deeper and steadier, which sends a direct signal to your nervous system that the situation is not actually dangerous, since panicked breathing and calm, slow speech cannot easily coexist. Third, and this surprises many learners, slower speech is almost universally perceived by listeners as more confident, more authoritative, and more intelligent, not less. Think about the most respected speakers you have ever listened to. Professors, leaders, experienced professionals. They rarely rush their words. They pause. They take their time. They trust that their message deserves space to be heard clearly. I want to give you a specific practical exercise to build this skill. Choose any short paragraph. It could be from a book, an article, or even this very script. Practice reading it aloud at what feels like an uncomfortably slow pace, slower than you would ever naturally speak. Pause deliberately after each sentence, even counting silently to 2 before continuing. At first, this will feel strange, even embarrassing, because slow speech feels unfamiliar and vulnerable when you are used to rushing through English out of nervousness. But continue practicing this exaggerated slow pace regularly, perhaps 5 or 10 minutes a day, and something remarkable happens over time. Your baseline speaking speed, the natural pace you use without thinking about it, gradually shifts to become calmer and more deliberate, even in real conversations. You are essentially retraining your nervous system's default speaking rhythm, moving it away from the panicked, rushed pattern anxiety creates, toward the calm, clear pattern of confident communication. There is another important benefit to slowing down that many learners never consider: the strategic use of pauses. Native speakers pause constantly in natural conversation to think, to emphasize a point, to breathe, to allow the listener to absorb what was just said. Yet many English learners feel intense pressure to fill every single second with words, believing that silence reveals weakness or incompetence. This belief creates enormous unnecessary pressure. In reality, a short pause while you gather your thoughts is completely normal, completely expected, and almost never noticed as a problem by listeners. If you need a moment to think of a word or organize your sentence, you are allowed to pause. You do not need to fill that silence with nervous filler sounds or rush ahead with an incomplete, confused sentence just to avoid a moment of quiet. Give yourself permission right now to pause when you need to. That pause is not a failure. It is simply part of natural, thoughtful communication used by confident speakers in every language around the world. Starting today, practice this simple but transformative shift. Slow down your speech deliberately, embrace natural pauses without shame, and watch how much calmer, clearer, and more confident your English conversations begin to feel. One more practical tool worth mentioning here is the strategic use of simple bridging phrases while you gather your thoughts. Phrases like, "Let me think about that for a moment," or "That is a good question, give me a second." These short phrases, common in natural speech among fluent speakers of any language, serve a wonderful dual purpose. They give you a few extra seconds to organize your thoughts calmly, and at the same time, they signal to your listener that you are actively engaged and thinking rather than confused or lost. Many anxious learners avoid these bridging phrases because they feel like an admission of difficulty, yet in reality, native speakers use them constantly, in every language, simply because real thinking takes real time, and confident speakers feel no shame in acknowledging this basic universal truth of human communication. Chapter 7: Training your brain through shadowing and repetition. Now that we understand the psychological roots of speaking anxiety, let us move into one of the most effective practical training methods available to English learners, a technique called shadowing. Shadowing is a method where you listen to a native or fluent English speaker and simultaneously, or with only a very slight delay, repeat exactly what they are saying, matching their words, their rhythm, their intonation, and their pacing as closely as possible. This might sound simple, even a little strange the first time you try it, but shadowing is used by professional interpreters, actors, and serious language learners around the world because of its remarkable ability to train not just vocabulary and grammar, but the actual physical and neurological patterns required for fluent, natural-sounding speech. Here is why shadowing works so powerfully for reducing speaking anxiety specifically. When you shadow a recording, you are not creating your own sentences from scratch. You are not searching your memory for the right word. You are not constructing grammar in real time under pressure. Instead, you are simply following along, letting the recording guide your mouth, your rhythm, and your pronunciation. This removes almost all of the cognitive load that normally triggers anxiety during real conversations, since there is no risk of making a mistake in word choice, no fear of forgetting vocabulary, and no pressure of unpredictable back and forth exchange with another person. Because the anxiety triggers are removed, your brain and your mouth are free to focus entirely on the physical experience of speaking English fluently and naturally, building what we might call muscle memory for English speech, the same way a musician builds muscle memory for playing scales before performing a full piece of music. Over time, with consistent shadowing practice, something remarkable begins to happen. The rhythms, intonation patterns, and natural phrases you have repeated hundreds of times begin to surface automatically in your own spontaneous speech, without conscious effort. You are no longer translating word by word from your native language. You are drawing directly from a library of natural English patterns your mouth and brain have physically practiced many times before. This is fundamentally different from simply memorizing vocabulary lists or grammar rules, because shadowing trains the physical, automatic aspect of speech production, the part of fluency that feels effortless in confident speakers, rather than only the intellectual knowledge of language rules. Let me walk you through exactly how to practice shadowing effectively. Choose audio content that is slightly below your current comfort level in terms of speed and complexity. This could be a podcast, a movie scene, a news segment, or even short video clips designed for learners. It is important that the content is at a pace and vocabulary level you can mostly follow without becoming overwhelmed. since shadowing content that is far too advanced will simply create frustration rather than productive practice. Begin by listening to a short segment, perhaps just 10 or 15 seconds, several times, without speaking, simply absorbing the rhythm and pronunciation. Once you feel familiar with the segment, play it again and speak along simultaneously, doing your very best to match the speaker's pace, stress patterns, and intonation, even if your pronunciation is not perfect at first. Do not worry about understanding every single word intellectually during this exercise. The goal is physical repetition and pattern absorption, not translation or analysis. Consistency matters far more than duration in shadowing practice. 10 focused minutes of shadowing every day will produce dramatically better results than one long, exhausting hour once a week. This is because shadowing works through repetition and gradual neurological adaptation, similar to how physical exercise builds muscle strength gradually over consistent sessions, rather than through occasional intense efforts. I recommend choosing a small set of audio clips, perhaps 3 to 5 short segments, and shadowing them repeatedly over several days until you feel a genuine sense of ease and familiarity with them, before moving on to new material. This depth of practice with a smaller amount of content will build far stronger, more automatic speech patterns than constantly moving to new, unfamiliar content before truly mastering the rhythm of what came before. As you continue this practice over weeks and months, you will likely notice something wonderful happening in your real conversations. Certain phrases, certain sentence rhythms, certain natural expressions will begin appearing in your own spontaneous speech without any conscious effort to remember them. This is the moment when shadowing practice begins paying enormous dividends, transforming intellectual knowledge of English into automatic, embodied fluency, exactly the kind of fluency that feels so effortless and natural when you speak alone, now beginning to appear in real conversations with real people as well. Many learners ask me whether shadowing feels uncomfortable or even silly at first, speaking along with a recording, sometimes mimicking an accent quite different from their own natural speaking voice. This discomfort is completely normal and tends to fade quickly with practice, usually within the first week or two of consistent effort. I encourage you to practice shadowing in a private space, exactly like your comfortable, anxiety-free solo speaking environment, where you can experiment freely without any self-consciousness about how you sound. Remember, the goal of shadowing is not to perfectly imitate an accent or become indistinguishable from a native speaker. The goal is simply to absorb natural rhythm, stress, and pacing patterns that will support clearer, more confident communication regardless of your own unique accent, which is, after all, a completely normal and acceptable part of speaking a second language. Chapter 8: Turning Mistakes into Fuel Instead of Fear. For most English learners, a mistake feels like a small disaster, a moment of embarrassment to be avoided at almost any cost. This fear of mistakes is, without exaggeration, one of the single biggest obstacles standing between you and confident, fluent speaking. In this chapter, we are going to completely rebuild your relationship with mistakes, transforming them from something to fear into something to actively welcome, because mistakes, properly understood, are not signs of failure. They are the primary mechanism through which fluency is built. Let us begin with a simple but profound truth. Every fluent speaker you have ever admired, whether a native speaker or someone who learned English as a second language, made an enormous number of mistakes on their way to fluency. Nobody in the history of language learning has ever become fluent without making mistakes along the way. This is not a comforting exaggeration. It is a basic fact of how human brains acquire language. Your brain learns through a process of prediction and correction. You attempt to produce a sentence. You receive feedback, whether from a listener's confused expression, a gentle correction, or simply your own realization that something sounded wrong, and your brain adjusts its internal model of English slightly based on that feedback. This process repeats thousands upon thousands of times, gradually refining your accuracy. Without mistakes, there would be no corrective feedback, and without corrective feedback, there would be no learning. Mistakes are not obstacles blocking your path to fluency. They are literally the mechanism by which fluency is constructed, brick by brick, correction by correction. Once you truly internalize this idea, your entire emotional relationship with speaking begins to shift. Instead of treating each conversation as a test where mistakes represent failure, you can begin treating each conversation as a training session where mistakes represent valuable data, information your brain needs in order to improve. This reframing might sound simple, but it produces a profound psychological shift. Athletes, musicians, and skilled professionals in every field understand this principle deeply. They know that improvement requires attempting things at the edge of their current ability, which inevitably means occasionally failing, missing a note, missing a shot, saying a sentence incorrectly. The difference between someone who improves quickly and someone who stays stuck for years is very rarely talent. It is almost always their relationship with mistakes. Those who improve quickly treat mistakes as useful, even exciting evidence of growth happening in real time. Those who stay stuck treat mistakes as threats to be avoided at all costs, which naturally leads them to avoid speaking altogether, the very activity required for improvement. I want to introduce you to a specific mental exercise that many of my most successful students have used to transform their relationship with mistakes. After making a mistake in English, instead of allowing your inner critic to attack you, practice saying to yourself, silently or even quietly under your breath, "Good, now I know." This short phrase accomplishes several powerful things at once. It acknowledges the mistake honestly, without denial or avoidance, which is important because pretending mistakes did not happen prevents genuine learning. At the same time, it reframes the mistake immediately as valuable information rather than personal failure, shifting your emotional response from shame to curiosity. Over time, with repeated practice, this small phrase can genuinely rewire your automatic emotional reaction to mistakes, transforming what used to trigger anxiety and self-criticism into something closer to mild, productive interest. There is another important dimension to this mistake-friendly mindset, and it involves how you interpret other people's reactions to your mistakes. Earlier, in our discussion of the spotlight effect, we established that listeners notice and remember far fewer of your mistakes than you assume. But even in situations where a listener does notice a mistake, and even in situations where they gently correct you, this correction is almost never a judgment of your worth or intelligence. It is simply information, exactly the kind of information your brain needs to improve. When someone corrects your grammar or pronunciation, rather than experiencing this as criticism, try experiencing it as a free gift, a small piece of valuable data handed to you, helping your internal model of English become slightly more accurate. Fluent bilingual speakers around the world, people who learnt a second or third language successfully, consistently report that welcoming correction, rather than fearing it, was one of the most important factors in their success. The learners who ask others to correct them, who actively seek out feedback rather than avoiding it, consistently progress faster than those who hide their mistakes out of fear or embarrassment. Starting today, I want you to make a conscious commitment not to avoid mistakes, which is impossible and counterproductive, but to welcome them as proof that you are actively engaging with real English, real conversations, real growth. Every mistake you make while genuinely trying to communicate is worth infinitely more for your actual fluency development than 100 sentences spoken silently and perfectly inside your own head, where no real learning through feedback can occur. Mistakes are not the enemy standing between you and fluent English. They are the very road you must walk to get there. I also want to gently address a common fear underneath this topic, the worry that repeated mistakes signal a permanent limitation, a sign that perhaps you are simply not capable of ever reaching fluency. This fear, while understandable, confuses two very different things: the natural, temporary mistakes of an active learning process and a fixed, permanent ceiling on ability. Every mistake you make today is evidence of active learning in progress, not evidence of a permanent ceiling. In the same way a child learning to walk stumbles and falls repeatedly, not because they are permanently incapable of walking, but because stumbling is simply part of how walking is learned. There is no version of language acquisition for anyone, anywhere, at any age that skips this stumbling stage. Give yourself the same grace you would naturally give a child learning to walk, and trust that your current mistakes are simply today's necessary stumbles on the way toward tomorrow's steadier steps. Chapter 9. Practical daily exercises to build fearless speaking. Understanding the psychology behind your speaking anxiety is essential, but understanding alone will not change your speaking ability without consistent, practical action. In this chapter, I want to walk you through a set of specific daily exercises, tools you can begin using immediately that combine everything we have discussed so far into a practical training routine. Think of these exercises as your daily gym workout, but instead of building physical muscles, you are building the mental and physical pathways required for confident, natural English speech. The first exercise is what I call the mirror monologue. Stand in front of a mirror or sit facing your phone camera and speak about any simple topic for 2 to 3 minutes. Your day, your opinion on something small, a description of your favorite food. The key element here is maintaining eye contact with yourself in the mirror or camera throughout the entire exercise, exactly as you would maintain eye contact with a real listener. This exercise is remarkably powerful because it gently bridges the gap between the safety of speaking completely alone and the social awareness of speaking to another person. Seeing your own face, watching your own expressions, and maintaining that eye contact activates a mild version of the social self-awareness that normally triggers anxiety, but in a completely safe, private environment. Practicing this daily, even for just a few minutes, gradually reduces the intensity of that self-awareness trigger, making it feel less overwhelming when you eventually face it with a real person. The second exercise builds directly on the shadowing technique from our previous chapter, but adds an important variation called delayed shadowing. Instead of speaking simultaneously with the recording, listen to a short sentence, pause the recording, and then repeat the sentence from memory, trying to match the rhythm and pronunciation as closely as possible before checking yourself against the original. This variation adds a small memory and retrieval component closer to the demands of real conversation, while still remaining far less stressful than an unpredictable back-and-forth exchange with another person. Practicing this for 10 minutes daily builds both your pronunciation accuracy and your ability to retrieve and reproduce natural English phrases under mild time pressure. The third exercise is something I call the worry list technique, and it directly targets the inner critic we discussed earlier. Before a speaking situation that makes you nervous, take 60 seconds to write down, quickly and honestly, every fearful thought running through your mind. They will think I am stupid, I will forget my words, my accent is embarrassing. Simply externalizing these thoughts onto paper, rather than letting them spin endlessly inside your head, reduces their emotional intensity significantly, a phenomenon well documented in psychological research on anxiety and worry. Once you have written your fears down, take 1 more minute to write a short, realistic, kinder response beneath each one. Instead of, they will think I am stupid, write, most people are focused on their own thoughts, and even if I make a mistake, it will likely be forgotten within minutes. This exercise trains you to consciously counter your inner critic with more accurate, evidence-based thoughts, gradually building the habit of self-compassion we discussed in Chapter 2. The fourth exercise involves deliberately seeking out low-stakes conversations with strangers, exactly as we discussed in our graded exposure ladder in Chapter 5. I want you to set a specific, small, achievable goal. For example, having one brief English conversation with a stranger, in person or online, at least 3 times this week. This could be as simple as asking a question in an online forum, chatting briefly with someone in a language exchange app, or speaking to a stranger while traveling or shopping if you live somewhere English is commonly spoken. The specific content of these conversations matters far less than the simple repeated act of speaking English in real, unpredictable, low-stakes situations where any mistake carries essentially no long-term consequence. This repeated exposure is what gradually retrains your nervous system's threat assessment, the deepest, most permanent form of confidence building available to you. Finally, I want to introduce a nightly reflection practice that ties all of these exercises together. At the end of each day, take just 2 or 3 minutes to think back over any English speaking you did that day, whether alone, with a recording, or with another person. And ask yourself 3 simple questions. What went well today? What is one small thing I can improve tomorrow? And what did I learn about myself as a speaker today? This reflection practice builds what psychologists call a growth mindset, specifically around your speaking ability, training your brain to notice progress and learning rather than only noticing mistakes and failures. Over weeks and months, this consistent, gentle reflection compounds into a genuinely transformed relationship with English speaking, one built on curiosity, patience, and steady, visible progress rather than fear and self-judgment. I want to be honest with you about something important. None of these exercises are magic. None of them will transform your speaking ability overnight after a single practice session. But consistency, even just 10 or 15 minutes daily across these exercises, compounds powerfully over weeks and months, exactly the way small, regular deposits compound into significant savings over time. The learners who transform their speaking ability are very rarely the most naturally talented. They are almost always the most consistent, the ones who show up daily, even imperfectly, even when progress feels slow and invisible in the moment. I encourage you, starting today, to choose just one of these 5 exercises and commit to practicing it daily for the next 7 days before adding a second exercise into your routine. Small, sustainable, consistent action, repeated patiently over time, will take you further than any single dramatic effort ever could. If you find yourself missing a day here or there, please resist the urge to judge yourself harshly or abandon the entire plan out of frustration. Consistency does not require perfection. It simply requires returning to the practice again and again over time, even after occasional gaps. Think of building this new speaking confidence the same way you might think of building physical fitness. A missed workout does not erase previous progress. It simply means the next workout matters a little more. Approach these exercises with the same patient, forgiving attitude, and you will find yourself sustaining this practice far longer and with far better results than if you demand flawless daily perfection from yourself right from the very beginning. Chapter 10. Your 30-day transformation plan. We have covered a tremendous amount of psychology and practical technique throughout this video, and I do not want you to leave this lesson feeling overwhelmed by too much information without a clear path forward. In this final chapter, I want to give you a simple, structured 30-day plan, bringing together everything we have discussed into a single, manageable roadmap you can follow starting today. Remember, transformation in speaking confidence does not happen through occasional bursts of motivation. It happens through small, consistent daily actions, repeated patiently over time until new patterns become your natural default. During the first week of this plan, your primary focus will be awareness and foundation. Each day, spend just 5 minutes observing your inner voice, specifically during any moment when you feel nervous about speaking English, whether in real conversation or even just imagining a future conversation. Simply notice, and if possible, write down what your inner critic says in these moments. Alongside this awareness practice, begin your mirror monologue exercise from Chapter 9, speaking for 2 to 3 minutes daily on any simple topic while maintaining eye contact with yourself. The goal this week is not yet to fix anything, simply to build clear, honest awareness of your current patterns, both the fearful thoughts running through your mind and the physical experience of speaking while watching yourself. Awareness, as we discussed earlier, is always the necessary first step before change can occur, because you cannot transform a pattern you have not yet clearly noticed. During the second week, we begin actively working with the inner critic using the worry list technique from Chapter 9. Before any speaking situation that creates nervousness, even a small daily conversation, spend 1 or 2 minutes writing down your fearful thoughts, followed immediately by a calmer, more accurate counter thought for each one. Continue your mirror monologue practice as well, but this week, begin gently increasing the difficulty, perhaps speaking on a slightly more complex topic, or extending your speaking time to 4 or 5 minutes. Additionally, begin your shadowing practice this week, choosing a short audio clip you enjoy and shadowing it for 10 minutes daily, simply following along with the speaker's rhythm and pronunciation without worrying about perfect accuracy. By the end of this week, you should be building a small but real toolkit for managing your inner critic in real time, alongside physical practice, building natural English rhythm through shadowing. The third week is where we begin moving toward real social interaction, following the graded exposure ladder from Chapter 5. If you have not already been speaking with a trusted friend or language exchange partner, begin doing so this week, even just once or twice, for a short, low-pressure conversation. Before this conversation, use your worry list technique to calm your inner critic, and remember the spotlight effect from Chapter 4, reminding yourself that your listener is far less focused on judging your mistakes than your fear imagines. During the conversation itself, consciously practice the slowing down technique from Chapter 6, deliberately pacing your speech more slowly than feels natural, allowing yourself full permission to pause when needed. After the conversation, regardless of how it went, use the mistake reframe from Chapter 8, silently telling yourself, "Good, now I know," for any mistake you noticed, and spend a few minutes in nightly reflection, noting what went well and what you learned about yourself as a speaker. Continue your daily shadowing and mirror monologue practices throughout this week as well, since these foundational exercises continue building your underlying skill, even as you add real conversation practice on top. The fourth and final week of this plan focuses on expanding your comfort zone further, following the next steps on your graded exposure ladder. This week, aim for at least 2 or 3 brief, low-stakes conversations with strangers, whether in person, through a language exchange app, or in any other safe, low-pressure context available to you. Continue applying everything you have practiced in the previous 3 weeks, calming your inner critic before speaking, remembering the spotlight effect during conversation, slowing your pace deliberately, welcoming mistakes as valuable feedback rather than failure, and reflecting honestly each night on your progress. By the end of this 4th week, many learners notice a genuinely different emotional experience around English speaking. Not perfect confidence, that is not a realistic goal for just 30 days, but a noticeably reduced intensity of fear, a greater sense of capability, and real, tangible evidence drawn from your own recent experience that you can survive and even grow from real English conversations. I want to be completely honest with you about what this 30-day plan can and cannot accomplish. It will not transform you into a flawless native-level speaker in 1 month. No realistic method could promise that, and you should be deeply skeptical of anyone who claims otherwise. What this plan can genuinely accomplish, if you follow it consistently, is a meaningful shift in your relationship with English speaking itself, moving you from a place of fear and avoidance toward a place of curiosity, patience, and steady engagement. This shift, though it might sound modest, is actually the single most important factor in long-term fluency development, because fluency is not built in a single month of intense effort. It is built through years of consistent engagement, and consistent engagement is only possible once the fear that currently makes you avoid speaking has been meaningfully reduced. This 30-day plan is not the finish line, it is the foundation, the starting point from which genuine, lasting fluency can finally begin to grow, freely and naturally, the same way it already grows so easily when you speak alone in the safety of your own room. I encourage you to actually write this plan down, somewhere you will see it daily, on a piece of paper by your desk, in a notes app on your phone, anywhere that will remind you of your commitment each morning. Transformation of any kind, including the transformation from a fearful, silent English speaker to a confident, engaged one, requires structure and reminders, especially during the early weeks before new habits feel natural. Trust this process. Trust the small, sometimes uncomfortable steps. And trust that the confident, articulate version of you that already exists when you speak alone is not a separate person from the one who will eventually speak just as freely with others. It is simply waiting, patiently, for the right conditions and consistent practice to bring it fully into the world. Before we finish today, I want to take a few minutes to walk back through everything we have discovered together, because I believe repetition, especially of the most important ideas, is one of the most powerful tools for making sure a lesson truly changes the way you think and act, rather than simply becoming another video you watched once and quickly forgot. We began this journey by identifying the strange, painful gap so many of you experience: the ability to speak beautifully and fluently when completely alone, contrasted with the sudden freeze, the blank mind, the tight throat that appears the moment a real listener enters the conversation. We discovered that this gap is not evidence of poor ability, poor memory, or poor intelligence. It is evidence of an ancient, deeply wired survival system inside your brain. A system built over hundreds of thousands of years of human evolution to protect you from social rejection, now misfiring in a modern context where the actual danger of a grammar mistake is, in reality, almost nothing at all. We explored the inner critic, that harsh voice inside your head that transforms a simple language mistake into a judgment about your entire worth and intelligence. And we learned that this voice, however loud and convincing it feels, is not a fixed, permanent part of who you are. It is a learned habit, built through repetition over years, which means it can be gradually replaced with a kinder, more accurate, more useful inner voice through consistent, deliberate practice. We examined why speaking alone feels so effortless, discovering that the calm, fluent version of you that emerges in private is not a separate skill from conversational speaking, but the very same skill existing simply in a safer emotional environment, an environment we can gradually recreate piece by piece in real conversations through the graded exposure method we discussed. We uncovered the spotlight effect, one of the most liberating pieces of psychological research available to any anxious speaker, learning that other people notice, judge, and remember our mistakes far, far less than our fearful minds imagine, and that most listeners, especially in the context of language learning, are focused primarily on understanding your meaning, often filled with quiet admiration for your effort and courage in speaking a second language at all, rather than harshly judging your imperfections. We built a practical ladder of small, achievable steps, moving gradually from the complete safety of speaking alone toward the greater challenge of real conversations with strangers and colleagues, understanding that confidence built slowly, through small, consistently winnable challenges, becomes far more permanent and resilient than confidence forced quickly through overwhelming, high-pressure situations before your nervous system is truly ready. We discovered the surprising power of simply slowing down, learning that rushed, panicked speech, driven by an anxious nervous system trying to escape an uncomfortable moment as quickly as possible, actually increases mistakes and increases anxiety in a vicious, self-reinforcing cycle, while deliberately slower, more measured speech, filled with natural, unashamed pauses, both reduces mistakes and is almost universally perceived by listeners as more confident and more intelligent, not less. We explored shadowing, a powerful, evidence-based technique used by professional interpreters and serious language learners around the world. Understanding how this simple practice of listening and repeating gradually builds the physical, automatic patterns of fluent speech, transforming intellectual knowledge of English grammar and vocabulary into the embodied, effortless fluency that currently exists only in your private, solo speaking. We completely rebuilt your relationship with mistakes, discovering that every single fluent speaker in human history, without exception, built their fluency through an enormous, uncountable number of mistakes along the way, and that mistakes are not obstacles standing between you and fluency. They are literally the mechanism, the essential fuel through which fluency is constructed. And finally, we brought all of these ideas together into a practical, structured 30-day plan, a clear, manageable roadmap of small, consistent daily actions designed to move you gently, week by week, from where you currently stand toward a genuinely calmer, more confident relationship with English conversation. Now, as we close this lesson together, I want to speak to you directly, teacher to student, human to human, for just a moment. I know, deeply and personally, how painful and how lonely this particular struggle can feel. I have worked with thousands of learners over the years, brilliant, capable, intelligent people, doctors, engineers, students, parents, professionals of every kind who carry a quiet, private shame about their English speaking. A shame that often has absolutely nothing to do with their actual level of knowledge or ability, and everything to do with this exact gap we have explored today, the difference between the fluent voice that exists in private and the frozen voice that appears in front of others. If this describes you, please hear me clearly when I say this. You are not broken, you are not uniquely bad at this. You are experiencing a completely normal, deeply human, biologically explainable pattern, one that has been experienced by countless learners before you, and one that can absolutely be changed, gradually, patiently, through exactly the kind of consistent, gentle practice we have outlined together today. I want you to remember something important as you move forward from this video. Progress in this area is rarely a straight line. You will likely have days where conversation feels easier, followed by days where the old fear resurfaces unexpectedly, perhaps triggered by a stressful situation, a harsh comment, or simply an off day where your mind feels tired and less resilient than usual. This is completely normal, and it does not mean you are failing or going backward. It simply means you are human, engaged in a genuine, ongoing process of growth, rather than a simple linear checklist that gets completed once and never needs attention again. Be patient with yourself on the difficult days, exactly as you would be patient with a good friend going through the exact same struggle. Return to the exercises, return to the reminders, return to this video if you need to, as many times as necessary. And trust that each small, consistent effort, even the ones that feel small and unremarkable in the moment, is quietly compounding into real, lasting change beneath the surface. The same way a seed planted underground shows no visible progress for weeks before suddenly breaking through the soil into visible growth. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today, learning together, exploring this topic with the seriousness and depth it truly deserves. If this lesson resonated with you, if you recognized yourself in the experiences we discussed today, I encourage you to take just one small action right now before you close this video. Choose one single exercise from everything we covered, perhaps the mirror monologue, perhaps the worry list technique, perhaps simply committing to speak more slowly in your next conversation, and commit to practicing it today, not tomorrow, not next week, today, while the ideas from this lesson are still fresh and alive in your mind. Small, immediate action, taken right after learning, is one of the most powerful ways to ensure that a lesson actually changes your life, rather than simply becoming another piece of information you agreed with intellectually but never actually applied. This has been Professor Henry, and this is English Mind Training, the place where we train not just the language skills of English, but the mind and the confidence required to actually use them freely, naturally, and without fear in every conversation life brings your way. I believe deeply in your ability to close this gap, to become someone whose confident, fluent speaking voice appears not only when you are alone, but in every room you walk into, with every person you meet. Keep practicing, keep being patient and kind with yourself, and I will see you again very soon in our next lesson together, right here on English Mind Training.